Everybody, I wanted to share my thoughts on vintage guitars just as a longtime buyer of guitars and someone who follows prices and different guitar makes and going rates and everything. And some of the prices for some of these guitars from the 50s and 60s are just astronomical. So I just wanted to share my thoughts on that a little bit. I hope you'll consider watching. Well, let me just start by saying I bought this Highway 1. It needs a setup. It's my third Highway 1. But I bought it, I just got it. It was $1,100 for a 2004 Highway 1. So that's kind of interesting. It was $1,100. Highway 1 sold for about $450 at when they were new at that time. So this was about a $450 guitar in 2004, which adjusted for inflation is about $700 today, according to Google Inflation Calculator. But one thing that's interesting about this, not that that's why I bought it, I just happen to think these are great guitars, but I do like a older guitar, and this is 18 years old. So according to how they market guitars, for Sweetwater and Guitar Center and a lot of these places, when it's 20 years old, it will get to be called a vintage guitar. I don't know what that'll do to the price. I don't think it'll do that much to it, but it is a guitar that's increased in value. I mean, it's even well over. It's worth now well over what it cost, and it's almost 20 years old. So this is something to consider. I paid $1,100 for it. Most Highway 1s seem to go for around that. I posted something on Facebook about buying this guitar for $1,100. And right away, there's always somebody that says, you paid too much, kind of implying I didn't know what I was doing, which possibly is true. But if you look around, a lot of Highway 1s, if they're in decent shape and haven't been all changed and modded or something, do seem to go for around $1,100, $1,200, and some go for around $1,500. At least that's what they're asking. So I don't know. But anyway, it seems pretty clear that this guitar is worth more now than it was when it was new. And that's kind of an interesting observation. But some of those vintage guitars from the 50s and 60s, they go for tens of thousands of dollars. And I've always wondered about the value of that. If you've got the money, and it'd be nice to have one, I guess. I like old things. I have a few antiques, and I like collecting kind of memorabilia too. But that's what I sort of consider those old guitars, like from '59 or something. To me, they're almost like memorabilia. Really, it's part of a memorabilia market more than a musical instrument market. That's just my opinion. It's hard for me to believe that any guitar from 1959, just sort of pound for pound, consistently is better than a new guitar, because the new guitars now are so well made. Just the tuners, the intonation, the way they cut things with lasers and measure things with computers. It's hard for me to believe that a guitar from '59, just as a average, is better than a guitar from today. I guess a couple things maybe that might be an exception to that, some might say, is the finish they used back then. I don't even think you can use the finish. I think even when you have like a nitrocellulose finish today, it's not quite the same. So those old guitars had a finish, and the wood's age. So those might be two things. And of course, I'm not really talking about acoustic guitars, but now on acoustic guitars, I have a Martin from 2004, and as that gets older, that'll definitely increase in value. And that's sort of legitimate because of those old acoustic guitars sound really good. The wood dries out. It takes a long time for the wood to dry. You know, another thing, it's possible that the wood in some of those old guitars is better, and that there's a subtle difference. That 59 Les Paul Jimmy Page plays. A lot of people say that it just has that sound, there's no other way you can get it. And maybe that's like wine, like old wine. There's a certain subtle excellence to a really good old wine. But, the other thing is it's subtle, and a lot of people can't tell the difference. Kind of like wine. If you want that subtle difference, a lot of times subtle differences can be very expensive differences, in my opinion. Kind of like wine. But it's hard for me to they're that much better that they're tens of thousands of dollars. To me, when you're paying tens of thousands of dollars for a guitar from that period, you're really buying memorabilia. And I wanted to say a little bit about that. I want to knock my guitar over. You know what this is? It's a big stack of comic books. I told you I like to collect things that are interesting. Classics Illustrated. These were at one point supposedly worth $100 a piece, and my mom used to buy them all the time. She was always encouraging us to read. What a great lady. But she bought them for $0.25 at the Union Lake Drug Store, and I used to go in there and buy them too for $0.25. 25 cents. Abraham Lincoln. The Red Badge of Courage, Stephen Crane, David Copperfield, comic version. Just don't tell your high school English teacher. That's how you know the story. These were 25 cents, and it's like old baseball cards. They gave them away in bubble gum, and a lot of those things ended up being worth thousands of dollars, and they were sort of everyday items. And I think that about a lot of these vintage guitars, those guitars that Clapton, Brownie, and Blackie, and some of those other guitars, they were just good guitars. They were just, good professional quality guitars, but they weren't particularly special. They were just good guitars, and they ended up being worth all this money. And almost any guitar from that period is worth a fortune today. But they were kind of off the rack guitars, a lot of those. And that goes to another point, which is, it's kind of interesting that Highway 1 is a kind of off-the-rack guitar, and it wasn't that expensive. And I sometimes think a lot of these custom shops and things they make are probably, no doubt, excellent guitars, but they're also kind of made to be collector's items. And when stuff is made to be collector's items, it's never worth as much money as all these old comic books, baseball cards, or just old rum-dum guitars that were just everyday guitars years ago, and people have all this affection for them. But it's really hard for me to believe that old guitar, just any one old guitar is just always better than any new guitar. All other things being equal. The other thing I wanted to say about this, which I think kind of goes to guitars, is those vintage prices you're seeing, to me, it's a memorabilia market, like Pawn Stars or Antique Roadshow. It's not really about the musical instrument itself. Some people might think that, but I feel like it's a memorabilia market. And another thing about memorabilia market, it's based on the idea of memory. And that's a lot of us that grew up with great guitar. We all grew up with great music, Buddy Holly, Elvis, the Beatles, the Stones, Dylan. And so those guitars mean so much to a lot of people my age and older, and you wonder if they'll have their value like that when young people come along. The kind of okay boomer generation, when young people come along, you wonder if they're really going to have the interest in it, like baseball. Baseball is kind of like music. The baseball players are probably better than ever. But as a rule, a lot of younger people, they don't grow up with baseball in the same way a lot of guys my age did, where almost every kid could play some baseball. And so when you have younger people coming up that they don't really relate to rock and roll, you wonder if those guitars will still have the value of being, $40 or $50,000 for a Telecaster. And that's the other final point is, I don't know. I don't think I kind of doubt these are worth $100 a piece, but for a while, Comic Illustrated were considered to be worth $100 a piece. I remember that. But that's what people would say. And it's only worth $100 till someone pays you $100. Until that, it's just, you can say it's worth whatever you want. It's like a Mickey Mantle baseball card. You can say it's worth $3,000, but how many people out there are just going to walk up to you and give you $3,000 for an old baseball card? There aren't that many. It's a pretty specialized market. For one, it's people who have the money laying around, and for two, it's people who have the interest. And I sort of think that about guitars, and I just wonder if they'll hold their value in the same way. But I would love to have like a 59 guitar, but I feel like it would be more just a history thing. I've always liked antiques. I've got a nice reed organ. I've got a 1947 Steinway piano that I really like. They're antiques and they're great instruments. That piano is really nice, and you could argue that pianos today in some ways aren't as good as some of those old pianos, I guess, but I don't know. See, I don't really know if that's true. If you buy a nice piano today, it's probably a pretty nice piano. And they definitely made some clunkers back then, because I think the consistency, no matter how much craftsmanship went into some of those, the consistency was more varied. But spending $50,000 on a Telecaster, if you can afford it, that's great. And I wish I could afford it, or I wish I could do that. But I do like that Highway 1, and it's an example to me of something less spectacular, which is a guitar that is today selling for more than it would cost. Fair amount more. Twice as much. And I don't know what at least the guitar stores say after 20 years it's vintage. I personally think that term is kind of a marketing hype term. And I don't think, is a 90s guitar considered vintage? I wouldn't necessarily say a 90s guitar is vintage, but according to the math of it, I guess they're sold as vintage. But I do know 70s guitars are now sort of entering a vintage market, whereas even just a few years ago, because I was raised in the 70s guitars weren't that sought after. We always talk about the CBS era in Fender, and that was bad. A lot of the greatest music ever was played on those old Fender CBS era guitars, but that period had a bad reputation. But now the 70s Fenders are starting to sell for a lot of money, and the same thing about Martins. Martin acoustic guitars. Martin in the 70s and 80s was always considered kind of inferior compared to the old Martins of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. But as time goes by, those old 70s Martins will get more and more cachet, and already are. But it's an interesting issue. But I still feel like the vintage guitar market is kind of like the market for these comic books or old baseball cards. It's based on nostalgia. It's more than music. And there's nothing wrong with that, because I'm a nostalgic person, and I like old things myself. So that's very cool. And I'm sure if you get one of those nice guitars, in some ways they're very cool, because the wood and the just in terms of things like intonation, action. I bet a lot of even just like the plastics and the connections with even plastics today are just better than they were 50 years ago. Even just, I don't know what they've done, but like my guitar picks are better. My guitar picks are better now than they were 50 years ago. You know, when I was a kid and I played, you know, like 40 years ago, they would crack all the time. My guitar picks are better, and I think that goes to a lot of the parts and that make up guitars. Guitars today are really good. I just wanted to share that thought. To me, a vintage guitar is primarily a memorabilia item, I think. Although it's possible that there's that, it's kind of like wine, there's that certain something that comes when the wood gets old. But a certain something is something a lot, it's also like wine. A lot of people can't tell the difference, and you're not really sure it's worth thousands of dollars. Kind of like wine. Thanks. God bless.